Even though I'm a second-generation Armenian whose grandparents emigrated here from Turkey, in many ways my childhood could not have been more WASP. I grew up in a Chicago suburb surrounded by white Protestants like myself. I had, count them, one Jewish friend. In those days, even my Catholic friend across the street seemed just a little exotic. There wasn't much diversity in America those days, it felt to me, and mainline Protestantism and being American were pretty much equivalent. It was the wallpaper of the culture. I officially joined the Presbyterian Church in 8th grade after a year or two of confirmation classes. That night that I joined was Maundy Thursday, the night in Holy Week when Jesus shared the Last Supper with his disciples before he was betrayed. I received communion for the first time that night. After the sermon, the minister said a prayer over the elements of communion. Then the elders took plates of little cubed bread and passed it along each pew. After we'd eaten the bread, the elders passed trays with these tiny glasses of grape juice. It was very special. It was dignified, sacred, reverent, and I still remember it with a sense of awe. But it wasn't until college, when our Presbyterian group shared a Shabbat meal with the students at Hillel, that I began to feel what it might have been like for Jesus to have shared supper with his friends. The candle lighting and songs, the prayers for the Sabbath, the thoughtful conversation and warm fellowship. They were even joking. It felt more like sitting down to supper with my family than a formal religious ritual, and it made me wonder, was this along the lines of what Jesus meant when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me"? Then in divinity school, I shared a Passover Seder for the first time, the first of many times. I may as well have been experiencing communion again for the first time. As we read the Exodus story, spilled wine in memory of the 10 plagues, and broke the matzah bread, it finally dawned on me what it meant that Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover meal. Even though I'd learned all this in class, that link between the Exodus, our liberation from slavery celebrated in Passover, and Christ's resurrection, our liberation from sin and death celebrated at Easter, that connection came alive for me that night. And when we read from Exodus chapter 13, Moses said to the people, remember this day when the Lord brought you out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and instituted Passover with the observance of unleavened bread. I finally understood what Jesus was pointing to when he instituted the Lord's Supper and said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Well, 2 years ago, another experience opened my eyes again, this time at table with new Muslim colleagues. I had just started to serve on the board of the Lebanese American University in Beirut. Though the school was founded by Presbyterians over a century ago, the board also includes many Muslims. This was my first board meeting in Lebanon, and frankly, my first trip to the Middle East. So I went early to get the lay of the land. Though I keep up with the news and I had done my homework, there were two things that I was completely unprepared for. First, I was deeply moved by the matter-of-fact way in which Muslims and Christians in Lebanon live side by side and have so for countless generations. In America still, all we hear about are clashes over differences in the Middle East, as if one single image could somehow describe the entire region. Moreover, all my life I'd heard from my Armenian grandmother about how the Muslims had slaughtered her family in the 1915 genocide in Turkey. It had honestly never occurred to me that Christians and Muslims could really live together in peace. In Lebanon, though things are never static, at that time, I saw what was possible. The second thing I was unprepared for was the extravagant hospitality offered by Muslims and Christians alike. Never could any of the meals have been called ordinary. One mezza, appetizer, followed by another. Grape leaves and hummus, baba ganoush and cheese pastries, then the soup, then the main courses, pilaf and vegetables, and the most succulent grilled meats, and baklava and cookies and Turkish coffee. For me, it was more than delicious. It was a powerful, visceral welcome because it felt like I had finally come home. Every single one of these dishes were those I had loved at my Armenian grandmother's table. But that was only half of it. The conversation was a feast of its own. We shared stories of family and travel, books and politics, religion and values. Time after time, meal after meal, I came as a stranger and emerged as a long-lost friend. And finally, it dawned on me, the act of breaking bread was never really about food. It was about hospitality, about welcoming the stranger. It was about overcoming tensions, a place in which religious or political differences were subsumed for the sake of the community. The act of breaking bread, it was at heart transformative. And I began to see in a new way the urgency of Jesus' commandment. He told us not just to remember him, but to do something, to do this. Break bread, share the cup, do this in remembrance of me. Well, most of us have traditions, practices of our faith that we've grown accustomed to. Often they're comforting to us, in part because they're simply so familiar. And we've participated in them so many times it feels like home. But sometimes our practices can become rote and stale and somewhat flat. Yet as I discovered, they do not have to be. I've come a long way from that dignified and awe-filled but slightly antiseptic First Communion I experienced in the 8th grade. It's still a mystery, but I've begun to understand what the late poet laureate Conrad Aiken meant when he wrote, "Music I heard with you was more than music, and bread I broke with you was more than bread." Bread we break with each other is much more than bread. It is a joyful feast of the people of God, a feast of singing and laughter. It is an act of willful memory, a rehearsal of God's saving acts of Exodus and resurrection, acts which God does still. And breaking bread is an act of hospitality that welcomes the other, that overcomes differences, and transforms strangers into friends. Well, I still love communion served on trays, little tiny pieces of cut up bread, and grape juice in those little glasses passed along roads. And I enjoy communion shared by intinction as we tear a piece of bread off the loaf and dip it in the cup. But because of bread broken at table with Muslims and Jews, I experience communion in a fuller, richer way than I could have ever known without them. Back in 8th grade, it would never have dawned on me that I could grow closer to Jesus Christ by sitting at table with people of other faiths. Who knew? It makes me wonder what more I can learn from them. My guess is plenty.